All right, we'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. Go straight into our informational items. It looks like we do have a quorum, but we don't have any voting items. But we'll go ahead and go into our first item, which is the Reclaim Quarterly Report. Susan.
Morning. So this is, I think, our 5th quarterly report. I'm not sure, but we will start here. And we just so kind of the bigger picture of what we've done over the past quarter. We've had continue doing the monthly working group meetings, continue working on the landing rules. We've had 7 working group meetings over the past quarter. The governing board adopted Rule 1134. In April. There are 2 facilities that have actually exited Reclaim, and then we're putting a hold, and we'll talk about that in the coming slides. And then we did have the face-to-face meeting with EPA, and we've had multiple conference calls with EPA on the discussion of new source review. So we did not have a working group meeting in March because we used that time to meet with EPA. We did have working group meetings in April, and we had one yesterday. Focus in April was to provide a recap of our discussions with EPA, and the working group yesterday focused on proposed amendments to 2001 and 2015, which Mike Morris will highlight after my presentation. And then we also provided additional details about a large source bank for offsets. So I wanted to provide a kind of an overview of where we're going and where we are. So there's a number of rules that need to be adopted before facilities can exit Reclaim. We've identified 13 landing rules. So those are either source-specific or industry-specific rules that have specific requirements, NOx requirements for the facilities. And then we have a rule, it's 2 rules, 218 and 218.1. And they will specify the monitoring, record-keeping, and reporting requirements when facilities are using continuous emissions monitoring system, SIMS. And so that is slated for the 4th quarter of 2019, possibly may slide into 2020. We've had 2 working group meetings on those proposed rules. The amendments to new source review, those are needed for the transition of the facilities to Reclaim. This would help to establish this large off-source NOx offset bank that we're working on. And then there would be amendments to Regulation 20, the existing Reclaim rules, as we finally start to see the transition of these facilities and setting the requirements in Reclaim for those facilities. All of these rules would be submitted to EPA for their approval for the state implementation plan. Then we would start the transition of facilities out of Reclaim. So prior to our discussions with EPA, we were starting to transition facilities, and I'll talk about, and it's actually the last slide, the discussions with EPA that their recommendation is that we hold off on the transition of facilities until everything is SIP approved. And so that's why we're making these amendments to rules 2001 and 2015. I wanted to provide also an overview of where we are in terms of the adopted landing rules and the amount of emission reductions. These are the emission reductions that are just associated with the Reclaim facilities. There's additional reductions that are associated with non-Reclaim facilities that some of these rules have affected, but the total amount of reductions is almost 4 tons per day from the 6 rules that have been adopted to date. So we have a number of rules that we're working on. 1110.2 is for engines, and that's going to come to the board in September. 1109.1, that's the refinery equipment rule. That is right now it's slated for the 4th quarter towards the end of this year, but we've been gathering additional data from the refineries. This is probably going to be moving to early 2020. And then the SIMS rule, 218 and 218.1. 1117 is for glass melting furnaces. And then we have a series of rules that we're going to be breaking off of from Rule 1147, which is the miscellaneous combustion. So we're going to pull the large Rule 1147.2, and then we're going to bring aggregate facilities into 1147.3. And those 3 sub-rules are going to affect Reclaim and non-Reclaim facilities, and we'll do a full BART analysis on those. So I wanted to provide an update on the discussions that we had with EPA on the face-to-face meeting. It was a good meeting. It was good to bring everybody in one room and discuss all the issues in more detail. And they have a better understanding of our perspective. We have a better understanding of their perspective. They said that they were in a listening mode. They weren't ready to make any major decisions. They did provide some initial feedback and insight into the various issues, but we still need to have ongoing discussions and more face-to-face meetings. So I just wanted to highlight on the three main issues. So on key issue number one, we had discussed with EPA in regards to the programmatic ongoing demonstration that there needs to be an equivalency demonstration with we refer to it as the SHAVE, the 2015 SHAVE, which is 12 tons per day. And EPA agrees there needs to be this programmatic demonstration. And then we also agreed with EPA, and they agree that there needs to be an ongoing demonstration for new source review for the Reclaim NSR program. And as facilities move out, the new facilities have an obligation to hold reclaim trading credits or RTCs at each year and on an ongoing basis. And so we would have an ongoing demonstration for that. So we discussed with EPA what this ongoing demonstration could look like. And we talked about that it would begin in January 2025. We would look at actual emissions and compare it to the remaining emissions when you remove the 12 tons per day, which is 14.5 tons per day. And we talked very generally about establishing procedures if you have an exceedance, but we didn't get into the details of what those particular procedures and measures would be. We want to leave it more open-ended, that it could be tailored based on what type of exceedance, the amount of exceedance, the time frame of the exceedance, instead of listing out specific backstop measures. We did discuss with EPA and with the working group. There is a control measure in the 2016 Air Quality Management Plan. It's referred to CMB05 that calls for an additional 5 tons per day. But that is different in regards to the commitment of the 12 tons per day. And we all agreed that that is an ongoing demonstration for the 5 tons per day is not needed. We would probably achieve what we can achieve, possibly more. We'll have to see through the implementation of the landing rules. Key issue number 2 in regards to permitting. This is, we teed up the discussion with EPA, but really no direction at this point in terms of anything formal. So we need additional discussions on this particular issue for permitting. And then key issue number 3, this is really the centerpiece in terms of as facilities exit reclaim, the availability of offsets. And we all agree that in the open market, there aren't sufficient NOx ERCs, emission reduction credits, that would be available in the open market. And that we agreed that we would develop some type of additional bank that the South Coast AQMD would manage, and that we would use offsets that are in the internal bank to help seed it. But then the details associated with that still need to be worked out. So we did discuss a little more with the working group, exploring the concept of options for fees and the accessibility of that particular bank, and concepts of how generally it could work, but much more work is needed to be done on the large offset bank. So the recent recommendations from the EPA is that we not exit any facilities. We keep all the facilities in reclaim until all of the rules and regulations are adopted and they're approved by EPA and the state implementation plan. So this would be all of the landing rules, all the amendments to Reg 13 as they pertain to the transition, and then to Reg 20. The time frame for that, it's, you know, hinges on our ability to get everything to the board. It hinges on EPA's ability to approve it in the SIP. I'm thinking we're probably, you know, possibly 3 to 4 years with the full approval of everything. But this is EPA's recommendation in regards to how we transition. So facilities that are in reclaim, as Mike Morris will highlight, will be subject to the command and control rules that we're adopting, and the reclaim shave, and so there's an overlay. But the benefit to the facilities is that they're going to be able to use reclaim resource review, which there are right now. There are plentiful RTCs available for them to make these modifications or when they trigger new source review. And so Mike will highlight the revisions in 2001 and 2015. So ongoing efforts, next steps, we'll continue the meetings, working group meetings, our work with EPA, and the rulemaking activities. That concludes my presentation.
Very good. Any board member questions?
Yes.
Yes, I have a question.
Supervisor?
You mentioned a couple different dates regarding EPA approval. Your early slide showed 18 months, and then a few minutes ago you said 3 to 4 years. So I'm a bit confused about what that might actually be and what the implications of those different dates might be.
So let me see. Can you pull the? So for the approval, you know, it's yeah. So yeah. So it's really hard for us to kind of gauge the approval, but so you know, I would estimate, depending on the last rule amendment that we have. Let's say if it occurred in fourth quarter 2020. I think if we're lucky, then, you know, a year that they approve it, but I think it could be 2 years after that. I'm really not exactly sure on the approval. There's no set time frame for the approval of those rules. I don't know, Barbara, is there?
Well, there is a statutory requirement for acting upon a rule within 18 months of the submission, but it's frequently not honored. Wayne's nodding his own experience.
Yeah, my experience is EPA would far exceed that in terms of 18 months.
But if we push them, they will sometimes accommodate us.
Sure.
And normally, when we submit rules to EPA for their approval, we typically don't wait for them to approve the rules. If we are confident about our rule, we move forward with the implementation. And if there are red flags later on raised by EPA, we agree to handle those through subsequent rule amendments. So
aggressive.
we have to be careful because this is a much bigger program. We got to tread gingerly, but I think if we are confident about what we are proposing, we may be able to find a way to move forward. A little bit soon.
Did that answer your question, Supervisor Rutherford?
Well, you seem to be saying that there aren't implications to when it gets approved, that we're just going to implement it anyway. Is that what I heard?
The landing rules, yes. EPA may want us to include provisions in kind of the programmatic rules that they wouldn't take effect until their approval. But typically we do command and control rules all the time that we implement on whatever schedule we want, regardless of whether EPA has approved them or not.
Okay, thanks for the info.
Any other board member questions?
Yes, I have some, Chairman.
Please, go ahead.
So you're talking about a large NOx source bank, and the plan is to use offsets and to use also our internal bank. Those are 2 different things, correct?
So what we're thinking of is the internal bank has about 20 tons per day of offsets in it. We need to make sure that we preserve a portion of those offsets for that bank is right now for the facilities, the smaller facilities, those that have a potential to emit that's less than 4 tons and 4 tons per year, and then for essential public services. So we need to make sure that we preserve, and so we want to at least take a portion to seed the other bank for the facilities that are greater than 4 tons, knowing that once we let them out of reclaim, they're gonna need to provide offsets for Regulation 13 use source review. They can no longer use the RTCs and the reclaim. So we're still doing some work to see it's 20 tons per day sounds like a lot, but these are the larger facilities. There's still work with EPA in regards to that those offsets were for minor sources. We're going to now be having major sources access that. There's a lot of details that still need to be worked out with EPA on the use of that. And then any concerns that we might have is that still enough for our facilities so we're not having a permit moratorium.
Could I add something to that, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Please, Barbara.
Yes, okay. So I thought your question was whether we were also going to use private market offsets to seed this bank. We've developed a terminology where we refer to those as emission reduction credits, or ERCs. We would not take those to seed the bank, but facilities would be free to buy them and use them instead of using our new internal bank if they wanted to do that.
So there's for reclaim facilities, when they exit, they can use the open market ERCs, emission reduction credits, or the large NOx source bank, which we refer to as offsets.
So do we,
Not the
okay.
In our approach, just to add one more thing, was to make sure that this newly created offset bank is being used judiciously. We were planning to charge them for use of those internal offsets. So they'll have the option to go either to the AQMD bank or rely on whatever little that exists there in the open market.
So we do anticipate, though, as reclaim comes to an end, that there won't be a private market. Is that what the anticipation is?
Well, there's not a reclaim, the reclaim RTCs, that's done, but there is the ERCs in the open market. So there is another market, but it's for the emission reduction credits.
Which exists right now.
Right.
It's just very
small.
slim, very small.
Okay. And
And
then,
it's small because most of the NOx sources are in reclaim.
In reclaim.
And they're using the RTC system, not creating
Right.
ERCs.
ERCs, okay. And then our internal bank, we would keep that. That's not going to go away because
Right.
you need to have that as a reserve source.
We need it for the less than 4 ton facilities in the central public services.
Right, okay. Now, the timing on this is getting stretched out, and it's stretched out beyond 2020. 2020 is when we will be doing our new air quality management plan, is that correct?
2020, we will, well, end of this year, we owe EPA an update to our SIP that deals with the contingency measures for the 182E5, the black box measures. But the next full AQMP for the next standard is not till finally due till 2022. It's a little bit independent of, we've already made the commitments in the past AQMPs for the reductions and the process we're talking about now. So it shouldn't have a lot of effect on the next AQMP, which will assume that this has all been worked out and we got the emission reductions we already said we would.
Okay. And then, tell me what happens if we don't accomplish what we expect to accomplish with our 2016 AQMP.
There's the smaller question on CMB05, which if on the question of CMB05 for the 5 tons, oftentimes when we have a control measure, the 5 tons is what we would expect. But as we get down to the rulemaking, it could be 4.8 or it could be 4, it could be 7. So as we adopt these landing rules, then we'll know how close we are on that 5 tons per day. But then on the larger AQMP question.
We touched on it at the board retreat about what we owe EPA this year, and it's a larger discussion, but we're working hard with CARB to figure out how we're going to make this submittal that is going to be much more specific about how it's, how we're going to make the 2023 deadline.
But it's a little bit different because it's based on the standard as opposed to the AQMP itself, right? I mean, we're looking at the 2023 8-hour ozone attainment at 75, right?
Like I said, the AQMP committed to 5 tons a day. That's our AQMP commitment regarding this piece. The larger question is attainment by 2023, and potentially without having sufficient funding to fund the AQMP, how do we interact with EPA? And that's coming due at the end of this year.
Okay. All right.
To be continued.
To be continued, yes. Okay, thank you.
Very good. Any other board member questions? All right.
Public comment?
Any public comment on this item? So there's no public comment then? Okay, well, next item, the summary for proposed rules 2001 and the 2015 backstop provisions.
Good morning, Councilmember Benoit and committee members. I'll be presenting a brief update on Rules 2001 and 2015. As background, as Susan mentioned, EPA during our face-to-face meeting recommended that we not allow facilities out of the reclaim program until all of the rules associated with the transition were state implementation approved. And we also received some feedback from our stakeholders with concerns about what might happen to the prices of reclaim trading credits as facilities are exiting. So with that, we're proposing that we remove the opt-out provisions put in place last October for Rule 2001. The facilities that are in reclaim now would remain in reclaim until this transition is complete and state implementation approved. That would mean that they would remain subject to the reclaim requirements, including the reclaim obligation for the 12-ton per year shave. They would stay in the new source review program under reclaim, but they would also be subject to these command and control rules that we're developing over the last couple of years. For Rule 2015, that rule is our backstop provision rule. Basically what it does is it indicates what we should do if the actual emissions exceed by more than 5% the allocations. And so in that particular case, we would be required to come back to the board and present provisions such as restricted trading or enhanced monitoring or technology review. And if those didn't work, then we would go forward with some type of command and control structure instead of the reclaim program. And as you know, we're already doing that. So we're looking at this as something that we might find a way to move around. In addition, as part of this backstop provision, we're required to provide an annual audit every March. Most of the information that we use for this annual audit come at the end of the year or at the very beginning of the calendar year. And so with that, it's clear that we're already moving towards removing the reclaim program and having these provisions in the rule that we have to come back and amend the program or go to some command and control requirement aren't always going to be necessary. And so in that case, what we're proposing is that we be able to provide a demonstration that we're already underway and that we're going to meet the requirements of the 14.5 allocation. And that would be in lieu of doing this, look at provisions or rescinding the program, because obviously we've already done that. In addition, we're looking at adding a month to when the report would be due. from March until April. That would provide extra time as a lot of the information is provided very close to the deadline for the report. With that, we're planning to bring these two amendments to the board in July of this year.
I'd like to, how much more?
I'm sorry. And so yesterday, we had our public consultation meeting, and our stakeholders indicated that they were a bit concerned about the proposal because the provisions that are already in the 2015 indicate that we do have some options, and that their feeling is that those options are sufficient as they are, and that we don't really need to have this extra provision.
In the March, April.
The March versus April.
Well, and there was one comment that said that there was a problem with the going to April, that there might be some timeliness issues with that. However, we do provide what would be time essential information, the trading credit prices on a monthly basis already.
All right. That concludes the presentation, I take it?
Yes, thank you, sorry.
It's all right. Any other board member questions or comments?
We do have public comment.
I sort of anticipated that with the cover we were giving first. So yeah, go ahead. Public comment, please.
No, over there.
Good morning. Michael Carroll with Latham & Watkins on behalf of the Regulatory Flexibility Group, which is an industry coalition. As we are one of the parties that expressed concerns about the proposed amendments to Rule 2015 at the public consultation meeting yesterday, and the current backstop provisions in Rule 2015, which are incorporated into the state implementation plan, provide for a range of actions that the agency can consider and can move forward with in the event that actual emissions exceed the allocations. And they include reverting to a command and control regime, which is exactly what is already being undertaken. So in essence, the agency is implementing the remedy before the problem, which may never come to fruition, but certainly before the problem exists if it ever does come to fruition. So our view is that you have the tools that you need in the current rule. The one thing that the current rule does not do is impose on the agency an obligation to demonstrate by a date certain the efficacy or the outcome of those measures. And the proposed language does that. It requires a demonstration by a date certain that the emissions will be below the 14.5 ton level. So our view is that the amendments are unnecessary. All they're really doing is imposing an obligation on the agency, which, as we sit here today, I think if we're being honest, none of us can say the agency could meet because we don't know yet until we get all the rules in place whether or not that demonstration could be made. So the amendments are not necessary, and they impose on the agency an obligation that it might not be able to satisfy. Perhaps even more troubling is that it enshrines in rule language a concept advanced by EPA, and we think being too readily accepted by the district staff, which is that the aggregate cap associated with the reclaim program as it currently exists is enshrined in the SIP forever, and that the agency will have to make an annual demonstration each year that actual emissions from those facilities are below the cap. And to fail to do that would be backsliding in EPA's view. Our view is that that is completely wrong. We think that the cap represents BARCed. That cap is being replaced by new command and control rules that represent BARCed, so it's an equivalent but different level of control, and that there's no need to have both the cap and the BARCed rules in place. And in fact, 2015, which is in the SIP, specifically contemplates scenarios where the actual emissions could exceed the allocations forever. And it doesn't say that you need to get the facilities back below that level. All it says is that you need to take certain steps, one of which is put a command and control program in place, which is in fact what you're doing. So We think it's unnecessary and sets a troubling precedent. So we'd urge you not to move forward with the amendments to 2015. Thank you.
Do we have another public commenter?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, all right.
Good morning. It's Frances Keeler with SEEB. Our biggest issue at this point, and we have been working with staff to try to work through this whole process. We understand it's a complex process and it's going to take a lot of time to get everything in place. But there is the second slide in this presentation where it says, while in reclaim, facilities will be subjected to command and control rules, reclaim obligations, and reclaim new source review. We think that layering command and control rules on top of the reclaim program results in a disparate impact on reclaim facilities over command and control facilities, which in Health and Safety Code 39616 says that the reclaim program cannot have a disparate impact. So we are carefully looking at that issue, and we look forward to more of a comprehensive review by staff on the impacts of the program. But we also think that it's easily solved by making a future effective date on the landing rules that you're adopting so that you don't have that disparate impact on the reclaimed facilities. And if the concern is in the future, then that's what we can work with. We also do think there's a slight issue with the language in 2015 that needs, I'm not sure I fully understand what the language as written. So I would like to hear from staff exactly a little bit more on what they're trying to accomplish, and we'll be working with staff on whether we think that's necessary language or not. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment?
No.
All right. Did staff have any other responses to the concerns that were brought up, or is what it is for the moment? We're still working on it.
So, the provisions in 2015 for the backstop provisions, the concept of what we were trying to incorporate into the proposed amended rule was the way the rule is currently structured is that it lists some potential options for backstop measures. And we could select those options, or we could select other options. But some of those options would be restricting trading, having pre-approval of trades, things that were, very that you're assuming that the reclaim program would continue on. So there is a second provision which Mike had referenced, which talks about that we would do an evaluation for command and control rules, source-specific rules. But how staff interpreted that particular provision is that we had to pass through the first set of backstops before we got to the second one. So we added this other provision really to provide relief that we would not have to put these onerous requirements on reclaim, knowing that we're already having these rules in place. And although we may be a little bit off, we know that implementation of those rules and achieving those reductions were just around the corner. That was the concept that we had. So I think in regard to Frances Keeler's comments, yes, we'd like to take another stab at the language. I think at the end of the day, if this is something that industry is not comfortable with, the concept of it was to hopefully provide some relief, but if they feel that this is not providing that relief that we were trying to provide in terms of implementing onerous backstop measures on the reclaim program, we can just remove it. It's just another option that was more specific. We could select it or not select it. We could go with the first, set of backstop measures that we list out in the rule. So that was our thought process behind it. So we'll continue to work with the stakeholders on the language, but at the end of the day, if this is something that is not desired, then we'll not move forward with that particular provision.
Susan, could you elaborate on the EPA consideration in terms of driving this?
This particular provision for the backstop was more of something staff had recommended, but it was recommended because EPA had recommended that we keep the facilities in reclaim. And knowing that the 2015, the shave, come 2022, that's when the final implementation of the shave will hit. We know that some of these compliance states that we're moving forward with in our landing rules, some of them might start as early as 2022, but there's many that will be post 2022. So the time frame in terms of, although actual emissions have been below the allocation, we know that there could be a little bit of a slight mismatch in that 2022, 2023 timeframe. So we wanted to have this provision in there to recognize, and EPA was okay with it, saying, we have these landing rules, these are the amount of reductions, this is what we're gonna achieve from it. It's basically what I think Mike had referenced in D2, we're already doing it, it was just to acknowledge that. So that was the concept behind that.
And just to take a step back, and it goes to some of Francis's comments about, being subject to command and control rules and still being in reclaim. Staff's original approach, which we thought made sense, was if you're subject to a landing rule and you're putting on the controls, you should get out. Like, there's no reason to be also subject to reclaim. You're doing the best, you're putting on the controls, get them out, and then the administrative requirements of reclaim go away. What EPA is telling us is that we can't approve any of these rules that you're going to send to us until we see the whole package, because they're viewing the reclaim program and all these rules and all the NSR provisions as one big whole, and they're not going to be willing to approve any of these individual rules, which would lead us to having a very large gap between, say, a command and control rule that we would submit to EPA and their eventual approval, or any programmatic changes, which puts a lot of uncertainty in the operations of these facilities. So that's why, after hearing EPA's arguments, the easiest way was to keep facilities in, and that solves that problem, but it also solves one of the stakeholder comments, which is this leave us in until NSR gets worked out, like, don't kick us out. So this, while we had opened the door to get facilities out in a previous amendment, now we're closing that door, because EPA, again, is not going to be approving any of these rules until we have the whole package. So that's what they've told us. We think it, solves a couple problems, but our original intent was not to have the double, have them subject to both. But at this point, it looks like that's where it's headed.
So does the demonstration give you an idea of where you are in the whole program? Is that why we would do that?
Well, this demonstration in terms of a backstop measure is very similar to what we're working on going forward as a programmatic demonstration, that we're not backsliding in EPA's opinion. I'm not conceding EPA's opinion is right, but it's this very similar demonstration that we could be building in to show that we're not backsliding from the current NSR program within the framework of reclaim. That's been one of EPA's arguments. We don't necessarily agree 100%, but we also know that we have that commitment anyway in terms of our AQMP. So if that same demonstration can serve to demonstrate that we're not backsliding on NSR and we're meeting our AQMP obligations, it's the same demonstration, then that's a pretty reasonable path forward to satisfy EPA's concerns, whether they're valid or not.
And this would only be, we would only look at this new provision if the actual emissions were 5% above the allocations. It's only, and it's to, hopefully say, we have these reductions, they're gonna occur, so we don't need to invoke any additional measures on these facilities.
So at the end of the day, when we have all the rules in place and we get it approved through EPA and the SIP, at that point, are we done with reclaim?
Yes.
That's the plan.
That's the plan. And we will achieve not only the 12 tons a day in the current, in that shade, but also the additional 5 tons a day commitment in the AQMP.
In the AQMP.
That's the goal.
And that would be 2023, something around then.
Well, the emission reductions, there'll be a schedule for implementation of emission reductions, and it'll follow that schedule.
And come 2023, when we look at the aggregate emissions, if we are below the reclaim allocation target, the
14.5.
14.5, even if EPA has not yet SIP approved all our command and control rules, we can still make the argument that we have met our SIP obligation as far as the reclaim transition goes, and we may be able to accelerate that reclaim transition out of the reclaim program.
May I quickly make a suggestion on 2015 that I think accomplishes the staff's objective without raising concerns? And that would be to
Go to the mic, Mike, thanks.
Like, why don't you wait till the chairman decides?
Yeah.
30 seconds.
Pondering.
30.
We'll allow you a quick 30 seconds here.
Okay. I understand that your desire is to be able to move straight to existing provision D2. You could simply modify existing provision D2 to say, in lieu of implementing measures contained in section D1, the executive officer may recommend that the governing board, and then it would continue. So that would allow you to go straight to D2 without any questions about whether you have to go through D1 first, without putting in the provision that we find troubling.
Mr. Chairman, we'll continue to work with all the stakeholders. And as Susan had explained, we're at a point where there isn't agreement, we can reconsider, but as far as this was an information only.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for the dialogue there, and I think it helps. And I know it's not normal, but I think it's still good to have. All right. We'll go ahead and go on to the third item, the proposed amendments for Regulation Reg 9, Standards of Performance for New Station Resources, and Reg 10, National Standards for Hazardous Air. Sarah.
Yes, hi, good morning. I'm Sarah Reese. I'm Assistant Deputy Executive Officer in Planning here at the district. I'm going to talk about our proposed amended regulations 9 and 10. Just a quick background on these. So regulations 9 and 10, that's where we incorporate by reference the federal New Source Performance Standards and NESHAPs. And what I'm going to talk about now with these amendments are the changes that EPA has made in the NSPS standards and the NESHAPs since 2016, which is the last time we amended these regulations. It's important to remember that everything I'm talking about today is already in effect. These are federal standards that have been finalized. There are facilities already subject to them. All we're doing is incorporating these regulations by reference, putting them in our rules, making that easier to facilitate local enforcement of those rules, and also for businesses that are subject to these rules, they have all of their requirements in one place that they can look at. So Regulation 9, that's where we have our New Source Performance Standards. These are the standards that are in CFR 40 Part 60. As New Source Performance Standards, they pertain to new, modified, or reconstructed sources of air pollution. This time around, we have there's one new standard that has been promulgated since the last time we amended this regulation, and then there's amendments to 6 existing standards. Fairly technical corrections for the most part, but I'm going to walk through them anyway. So the one new standard, this is for municipal solid waste landfills. This was a standard that was promulgated by EPA in 2016. And what it does is it sets thresholds by which landfills have to install gas collection systems and controls. So it reduced the threshold from 50 megagram per year to 34 megagram per year of non-methane organic compounds. If you're below that threshold, or if you meet that threshold, you need to install controls.
Can you explain this?
So a New Source Performance Standard is these are emission standards that apply to new sources of air pollution, as well as modified and reconstructed sources. So it's really the new sources that we're talking about here. So this NSPS, it also set criteria by which landfills don't have to install controls, or they can remove those controls. So for example, when a landfill closes, they can take those controls down. And it also provided alternative site-specific emission threshold determinations. So if you, by the ways you calculate whether you're emitting a certain amount of the NMOCs, if you can prove other ways where you're actually below the threshold through, for example, surface emission monitoring, that can also be a pathway to get you out of having to install controls. Question?
Does it apply to existing landfills?
So there are emission guidelines that are similar to this that also apply to existing landfills. I'm not talking about them in this rule because of Regulation 9 is for New Source Performance Standards only. The emission guidelines we incorporate into our Title V permits. So these are all going to be in increasing order of technicality. There's also an amendment to what they call the general provisions, subpart A. So that's just the different specific test data requirements. There was an amendment to the solid waste incineration units, subpart quad C. Again, a lot of different technical definitions. Probably the most substantive thing here is that they made a definition for a cement kiln and made it clear if you were subject to the solid waste subpart versus the Portland cement subpart, and so made it clearer for those facilities which section they were subject to. Again, these are all pretty technical for the subpart quad I. This allows, in cases where there's an emergency that affects or threatens human life, that you can bypass having to use your emission control systems, so that knowing that human life is paramount. With subpart quad J, it's QA/QC data for specific methods for VOC control measurements. And then on oil and natural gas sector, just making some changes on when requirements have to be delayed for fugitive emission repair. And then made an amendment for subpart quad Q for residential hydronic heaters and forced air furnaces. Again, just adding additional test methods by which they can prove compliance. And then the amendments to the appendices are, again, technical amendments for test methods. For the national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants, these are in 40 CFR Part 61. These again apply to both new and existing sources that emit hazardous air pollutants. In this case, since the last time we amended this provision in 2016, there's just an amendment to one existing standard and one appendix, both very technical pertaining to test methods. So I can go through the details if you want, but they're mostly technical and typo corrections. So with that, our schedule is we'll be setting hearing on this item June 7th, and then our public hearing on July 12th. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Very good. Any board member comments, questions? Any public comment?
No public comments.
So no. All right. So no questions. We have our written reports that are attached. Do we have any other business by any of our members or staff?
What am I doing here?
What was that, Supervisor? A question?
She's really happy to be here.
Very good. All right. Any other public comment? General public comment?
Why did Bill Burke put me on this committee?
Seeing none.
All right. With that, our next meeting will Friday, June 21st. Hopefully with maybe some items that we need to actually make some action on. And we'll be looking forward to our next meeting then. With that, we'll adjourn the meeting. Everyone have a great weekend.
You too. Bye-bye.